It always begins the same way. Just as the sun slips behind the trees and the shadows grow long, the tiny, bloodthirsty army makes its appearance. Mosquitoes. You hear that first faint whine in your ear, that high-pitched buzz that sends a shiver down your spine, and you know the battle has begun. Now, I've faced down storms that flattened tents, bears that raided coolers, even a long night shivering in the car when the mercury dropped lower than expected. But I'll tell you this, nothing tests a camper's spirit quite like a swarm of mosquitoes. They are relentless. They don't care if you're tired, if you've hiked 12 miles, or if all you want is to sit by the fire and let the night wrap around you. That one trip in particular sticks in my mind. A humid July evening, the kind where the air feels heavy, like you could wring the water out of it. The fire had been stubborn to light, the wood too damp, but we finally got a weak flame going. My buddy Mark pulled out a Citronella candle, set it right in the middle of the picnic table like some kind of sacred offering, and declared, "This will hold them off." We believed him, at least for a little while. The smoke rose lazily, smelled a bit like lemon and something faintly chemical, and we dared to hope we'd won a small victory. But you could hear them already, gathering in the darkness beyond the firelight, the way wolves might circle a camp in another kind of story. That's when the debate started. Mark swore by the Citronella candle. Jenny had a can of bug spray in her pack and said it was the only real defense worth trusting. Me? I've always been stubborn. I claimed you could outlast them, that if you just ignored the itching and the buzzing, eventually they'd get bored and move on. It was bravado, I admit. The kind of thing you say when you don't want to admit you forgot to pack your own spray. So there we sat, 3 campers against an army of wings and needles, each of us ready to prove our method was best. The first assault came quick. They always do. One second we were laughing about how primitive our little mosquito war council looked, and the next we were swatting like lunatics. Mark leaned in close to the Citronella candle, face glow with superstition. Mark scowled, waving a hand over his candle like he was tending a holy flame. And then there was me. Sheer suffering, my chosen weapon. I sat by the fire trying to act tough, refusing the spray, ignoring the candle, swatting only when absolutely necessary. But my arms were soon blotchy with bites, my ankles raw from scratching. Every time I slapped at my skin, I felt the sting of defeat. Still, I held out, telling myself it was all part of the camping experience, that I was tougher than they were. Truth was, they were winning. The fire crackled weakly, throwing off smoke that seemed to do more for us than the candle. I leaned closer to it, breathing in the wood smoke, letting it cling to my clothes. Mark and Jenny laughed at me, said I looked like some caveman crouched over his flames, but I didn't care. At least the mosquitoes hesitated when I was wrapped in smoke. That's when the real test began. The air got stiller, hotter, and the swarm grew thicker. It felt like the entire forest had emptied its mosquito population into our little clearing. The buzzing was a steady drone, maddening, constant, like being surrounded by 1,000 tiny violins, all playing the same shrill note. The battle lines were drawn, Citronella's fading hope, chemical shield, and stubborn endurance. We were about to find out which one of us would last the longest. By the time the sky turned fully dark, it felt less like camping and more like siege warfare. The fire threw long shadows across our sight, the smoke curling into the thick night air, but the mosquitoes pressed on. They were in our hair, our ears, even trying to crawl into the corners of our mouths if we laughed too wide. Mark was the first to falter. His precious Citronella candle had burned down to a weak puddle of wax, and by then it was clear the mosquitoes considered it nothing more than a decorative centerpiece. His face looked polka-dotted under the lantern light, and every time he slapped at his arm, he cursed under his breath. Finally, he shoved the candle aside and reached for Jenny's bug spray. "Don't say a word," he muttered, eyes narrowed. She just handed it over with a grin that said plenty without a sound. Brief relief it brought. My arms were welted, my ears burning, my neck raw from scratching, but I'd lasted longer than either of them. Still, the mosquitoes weren't retreating. They were winning, plain and simple. The smoke shield couldn't cover me forever, and every fresh bite felt like a tally mark in their column. At some point, we weren't campers anymore. We were prisoners in our own camp. Huddled close to the fire, shoulders brushing, swatting and scratching, laughing in that half-mad way you laugh when you realize you're not going to win. Not really. The war wasn't about victory anymore. It was about survival until morning. I remember thinking then, maybe the forest wasn't haunted by spirits or wolves, but by mosquitoes that had been perfecting their art of torment since long before we ever pitched a tent beneath those trees. The mosquitoes didn't just come in waves, they came in squadrons, each one finding a weakness in our lines. Mark's citronella candle sputtered low, the wax nearly gone, and he sat hunched over it like a gambler at a table who knows the dice are loaded against him. I swear the bugs seemed to mock him, darting in and out of the smoke as if to prove a point. He slapped at his ears, cursed under his breath, and muttered, "It's working, it's just a slow burn strategy." We all knew better. Jenny's bug spray shield began to falter too. The stuff worked well at first, but sweat and time wore it down. Soon the mosquitoes discovered her ankles, then the back of her neck where she hadn't sprayed thoroughly. Every few minutes she'd shake the can like it was some magic rattle, and reapply until the air around her was so thick with fumes, I wondered if she'd repel humans better than mosquitoes. She kept insisting, "It's still better than nothing," even as she scratched at her wrists. And me, well, my tactic of sheer suffering had collapsed long ago. I was covered in welts, itching like mad, but too stubborn to admit defeat. I'd pulled my socks over my pant legs, wrapped my bandana around my ears, and even sat in the heaviest smoke of the fire just to get a moment's peace. I probably looked like some smoke-choked scarecrow crouching by the flames. Every time a new bite burned into my skin, I told myself it was just part of the test. Knew the final round of this skirmish was still coming. By the time the last hour before midnight rolled around, the war had turned into pure survival. The fire burned low, spitting occasional sparks, its smoke barely drifting without much wind. The citronella candle guttered one last time and died, leaving only a waxy puddle as Mark sighed and admitted defeat. Jenny had nearly emptied her bug spray can, the hissing sound now weaker each time she pressed the nozzle. And me, I'd resigned myself to being a walking buffet, too itchy to sit still, pacing in small circles around the fire like some restless animal. The mosquitoes, sensing victory, pressed their advantage. They dove at ankles, at ears, at that soft spot on the back of the knee that always makes you yelp when bitten. We swatted, scratched, cursed, even tried singing loudly to drown out the endless whining buzz, but nothing worked. They had us cornered. Then, almost by accident, we stumbled upon the one trick that gave us peace. Jenny tossed a damp log onto the fire, and a thick column of smoke rolled over camp. It stung our eyes, made us cough, but for the first time all evening, the mosquitoes retreated. The air filled with that acrid, comforting haze, and suddenly we were free, sitting shoulder to shoulder, smoke curling around us, not caring if we smelled like burnt wood for the rest of the trip. We stayed that way for a long while, quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional slap when one stubborn mosquito dared to venture in. Finally, Mark chuckled, voice scratchy, and said, "Guess the real winner tonight was the smoke." Jenny nodded, leaning back against her pack with a tired grin. And me, I rubbed at my swollen arms and thought about how camping always seemed to come down to small lessons like this. Bug spray works, until it doesn't. Citronella is more for morale than protection, and suffering alone is just stubborn foolishness. But gather around a fire, lean into its smoke, and suddenly you found the oldest trick in the book. Older than bug spray, older than candles, older than our little debates. As the night grew quiet, I realized that was the real truth of it. Out here,